And we're back. Welcome back to the Solutions Manual podcast. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Maciek.
And in the spirit of the holiday season, pun intended, we are talking about drinking and alcohol and how to drink for your health.
Well, or how to drink not to damage your health.
That's right. So, sitting around Thanksgiving tables, Christmas tables, likely to be a lot of red wine. And red wine's good for health, right?
Well, I wish it was that simple to answer.
Mm-hmm.
There was an old study sponsored by French wine manufacturers that claimed that small amount of red wine can be good for cardiovascular health. Just one study published by a group with a clear interest in people consuming wine.
Sure.
That has never been successfully replicated, and later, over the decades, refuted and rebutted multiple times.
And we're basically talking about the study that showed that the antioxidant component found in red wine and other drinks, resveratrol, was beneficial. But we're clarifying that not only is that study a single study and of one, it has not been replicated, but it's been so sensationalized and so marketed that it's led to some incorrect information and
significant misconceptions.
Misconceptions. Yeah.
Yes, and I think the first misconception, even from that study, apart from it being poorly conducted, is that the substance that you've mentioned that is found in the skin of the grapes and on its own may be beneficial when consumed for cardiovascular health. But that does not offset the consequences of consuming ethanol and other substances contained in wine. But I think maybe let's talk about this concept first. Is it possible for something to be good and bad for health?
Of course. I think it depends on the dose, right? Too much or too little of something we're looking at it from that perspective, right? Too much or too little could be bad, depending on depending on the dose.
Depending on the substance and depending on the dose. Yes, I think so. A good example of this potential two different outcomes of the same substance is drinking coffee.
Ooh, yeah.
So there is relatively large body of evidence that suggests that consumption of small amount of coffee, 1 to no more than 3 cups, will decrease the risk of certain conditions like colorectal cancer, for example, or negative cardiovascular outcomes, or the risk of type 2 diabetes. But then if you start increasing the dose, that again becomes a problem. So some coffee is better than no coffee, but too much coffee is also bad or has negative consequences of your health. So some substances clearly can have that duality of effects, and it doesn't have to be just the things we eat. It could be our body composition. For example, too lean is just as unhealthy as having too much of excess fat.
Right.
When it comes to optimal health and longevity.
Right.
But now what's the story then with alcohol? So is this one of those substances where some red wine is better than no red wine?
No, it isn't. So that's also a misconception. Everything in moderation. But when it comes to alcohol, the data show, many studies show that any consumption of alcohol increases risk significantly for various diseases, cardiovascular diseases, cancers, liver disease. We'll talk about those in detail. So to simplify it, no, there does not seem to be a dose of alcohol there does not seem to be a dose of alcohol that provides a benefit.
Correct. And we know this from one of the largest studies on the effects of consumption of alcohol on cardiovascular health ever conducted, of more than 250,000 people in the UK that were followed up for more than 10 years and were specifically evaluated. Their cardiovascular risk was evaluated in the context of how much they drink. And the researchers looked at multiple cardiovascular health outcomes. They looked at heart attacks, stroke, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, hypertension. And the findings of that study were quite interesting, well, not surprising, but contrary to what many people believe is true, right? So a lot of people believe that consumptions of some alcohol is better than not drinking at all. But we've known this now for many, many years that it isn't. So in that particular research study, the authors looked whether any exposure to alcohol will increase or decrease, depending on a dose and frequency, the risk of the conditions that cardiovascular outcomes that we've just mentioned. And they narrowly looked at impacts on the circulatory system. They did not look at cancers. They did not look at other alcohol-related diseases like liver disease. They did not look at the impact on mental health. They did not look at the impact on gastrointestinal diseases. They did not look at the impact of alcohol on the function of the immune system, on the reproductive system, on muscular health and bone health. They narrowly looked at cardiovascular impact because that was the popular myth that people believe that small amount of wine might be good for people's hearts. And they have very clearly showed that consumption of alcohol dramatically increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases, and that risk increases exponentially with every additional unit of alcohol consumed.
And by how much does it increase?
So that would depend on the specific outcome. So for example, for hypertension, every unit will be increasing the risk by approximately 30% versus baseline. And then it stacks up on the top of the previous risk increase from the previous dose. So as you keep adding drinks, that risk goes up exponentially. So 3 drinks is not 3 times more than having 1 drink.
Because
it's much more than that.
From what you previously...
Yes.
On top of the risk from the previous drink.
On top of the previous increase.
Right.
Yes. And it very rapidly, very quickly goes up as you increase the number of units of alcohol that you consume. So the outcomes are pretty simple. It's absolutely clear that drinking is not good for your cardiovascular health, and that any amount of alcohol consumed will increase the risk. Right? So again, we talk 30% for hypertension. It's 40% with each unit for coronary artery disease, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So it's fairly significant.
Yeah. So with such a high-powered study, both in terms of being straightforward about the outcomes they were measuring, as well as the sample size alone, to yield that sort of those numbers around risk, I think that's the surprising part. Maybe an additional risk. I think it's easy for people to comprehend that the more you drink, the worse it will be. But to put numerical values around it that are in the tens of percentages on top of, and we're not even talking about other lifestyle or genetic behavior or behaviors that you already have a certain level of risk before you add alcohol. So, and before you add additional alcohol. So I think that's kind of a shocking thing to see what actually is the increase in risk. And now that we know that, and we've demonstrated it, and not just in this study, there's been other studies that look at all other cardiovascular diseases that show similar increase in risk. They
do, and we know that we just discussed the volume. So the more you drink, the more units of alcohol you consume, the higher the risk is. But we also know that this risk increases with drinking frequency as well. And we know that from the same study, that in those who drink more than 3 drinks per day, this risk elevation that we talked about, hypertension, would be more than 160% increase over baseline. And the risk of coronary artery disease will be almost 5 times higher. So it's almost 500% increase in those who drink more than 3 drinks per day every day. So the more frequently you drink and the more units of alcohol you consume daily, the worse the outcomes will be.
Right.
And those results are pretty clear. We'll put I think we should put the study in the podcast's notes so people can look at what the researchers found out.
Yeah.
And we'll also add the link to our solutions manual, where we clearly illustrate on how quickly that risk goes up versus those who do not drink.
Yeah.
So we're fairly clear when it comes to the answer to the question whether is drinking red wine beneficial for your health. Well, it clearly isn't.
Right. Right. Now the question is, like, why? How does it work? So maybe we can first come back and just do a little biochemistry 101 on ethanol.
Okay.
And then we can talk about the mechanisms of the risks, and not just for cardiovascular disease, but other diseases. Okay. Okay. So you drink alcohol, and it's primarily metabolized in the liver, and processing of alcohol requires an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase.
Yes.
That converts ethanol into acetaldehyde, which is a toxin.
Which is another toxic substance.
Yes, a byproduct of ethanol metabolism that is.
Yes.
It's very toxic. Now, the way the body handles the toxin is to couple it with a coenzyme, and then that gets reduced.
Yes.
Biochemically reduced during the process, and that allows safe elimination of alcohol, of the acetaldehyde. So acetaldehyde then can be converted into acetate, which is still harmful, but less so, and then released into the bloodstream, and can be used for energy production, it can be converted into acetyl-CoA, acetyl coenzyme A, which you need for building fat.
Correct. In
your muscles and your fat tissues. So this is how alcohol contributes to fat storage over time.
It does. And it also explains the additional energy that you get.
Right.
That is devoid of any nutrients.
Right.
But that's why we call drinking of alcoholic beverages as empty calories. Right. So there's an energy that your body will use, and it not only will contribute to accumulation on its own of fat tissue, it will also make whatever you've eaten or mixed the alcohol with more likely to be stored as fat because there's simply an excess of available energy.
That's right.
So I think we'll probably cover this in more detail later in the podcast, but we know, so it's clear from what you just described that purely due to the way the alcohol is metabolized, there's a toxicity of the byproducts of the alcohol, not just the alcohol ethanol itself, that some of the metabolites can later be used for energy, which contributes to the storage of additional fat tissue. And those things are not, like obesity is not a good thing for longevity.
That's right.
As well, which we can talk about that later in more detail. And we also know that some of the substances that circulate in your blood or might be later expelled or smelled through your lungs, they will also contribute to other problems, which we're going to cover later, namely development of cancers. Like those substances are highly carcinogenic as well.
That's right.
So, where do we go next?
First, let's mention the rate by which ethanol is metabolized.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the rate of ethanol metabolism is 7 to 10 grams per hour, which is about one standard drink. But so let's define
one standard unit.
One standard unit.
Yes, not drink. Drinks can contain more than one unit.
Yeah. Let's talk about units next.
Okay. Yeah. So we started with how much alcohol can be processed by your liver per hour, and any amount in excess of that amount is dramatically increasing toxicity and also depletes the capability of your liver to deal with the excess alcohol. Right, so we know it's capped at approximately 7 grams in females, up to 10 grams in males, and that's where the definition of the unit comes up. So a unit of alcohol has been first defined in late 1980s, to standardize or allow doctors to understand how much people drink and what the impact of alcohol consumption is on health. And 1 unit is considered to be 8 grams of pure ethanol. And because ethanol is lighter, so there's a difference between the weight of ethanol and water. So 10 milliliters of water would be 10 grams, but 10 milliliters of ethanol is approximately 8 grams of ethanol, which is between the 7 and 10 grams that your body is able to process per hour. Right. So at 8 grams of pure ethanol is 1 unit of alcohol. Now, this means that different drinks that contain different amounts of alcohol will contain a different amount of units of alcohol per drink. So let's try to explain how do we calculate this.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to calculate the alcohol by volume, or the AB, the standard measure of alcohol consumed, we need to look at what is the percentage content of alcohol in a drink, and then use it to calculate how many units of alcohol there are. So we take the strength, which is the percentage of alcohol, times the volume, and we divide it by 1,000 and we get units. So, for example, if you need to work out the number of units in a pint of beer, you take 5% times, a pint is roughly 550 milliliters, and so you multiply those two numbers, you divide it by 1,000,
Mm-hmm.
and it comes up to approximately just slightly under 3 units.
Okay, right.
So 5% is considered to be a medium or strong beer, right? 3.6 for weak, 4.5 for standard, over 5 for strong beers. An average pint of beer is approximately 3 units of alcohol. Now, so another example would be a small shot of a spirit. So 25 milliliters of clear spirits at 40% volume is approximately 1 unit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Small glass of red wine, so 125 milliliters at approximately 12% is 1.5 units. So we can relatively easily calculate the amount of units of alcohol we have consumed, which allows us to keep track and tell us what the risks are. Now, we know that any amount of alcohol is a problem
Mm-hmm.
for cardiovascular health, and we know that there's a difference in tolerance of alcohol depending whether you're a male or a female.
Now let's come back, before we move forward,
Mm-hmm.
let's come back to what we said previously. We noted that from the study that defined the increase in risk,
Yes.
we have increase in risk for hypertension with each additional unit
Mm-hmm.
was 160%.
In people who drink more than 3 units per day.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just to put that in context, right?
Mhm.
Based on how units are actually defined,
Mm-hmm.
and then for coronary artery disease, where it was almost 500%.
Yes. So odds ratio of over 5. Yes. Yes.
Right. Just from consuming that amount. If
Yes.
we standardize this and talk about this in terms of units.
Mm-hmm.
So that is even more, hopefully that putting that in that context and visualizing units of alcohol and the actual increase in risk is even more
Yes, because you can
clarifying.
have multiple units in a drink.
In a drink.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
And we're talking here only about the impact on cardiovascular outcomes.
That's right.
Because that's where this mythological wine industry sponsored study
started.
captured public attention.
Mm-hmm.
But that's impact on cardiovascular health is only one organ system that is impacted by the consumption of alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Alcohol is a toxin, and it impacts virtually every cell and every organ system in your body.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we can start with and see whether the similar observations extend to other diseases and conditions.
Yeah, that's a good idea. How about, let's talk about cancers.
Okay.
I think there's been, in addition to cardiovascular system,
Mm-hmm.
there's been a lot of work on effects of alcohol on cancer development.
Yes.
So one of those cancers that's predominantly studied, that's been shown to increase, that alcohol consumption alone increases risk of development of this cancer,
Mm-hmm.
is breast cancer.
Yes. Yes,
So-
correct. So it's not only breast cancer, but this is a great example. It's one of the most common and most significantly, one of the most common cancers in women. And as you said, in those who are not genetically predisposed to development of breast cancer, so those who do not have the BRCA1 or 2 gene variants,
Mm-hmm.
alcohol is the largest contributing factor to development of breast cancer.
Yeah.
Now, before we go into the details, let's talk about how is alcohol classified when it comes to the risk of developing cancer. So there are multiple classes of carcinogens, and alcohol has been classified as a class 1 carcinogen, which means it's a substance that is proven to be carcinogenic to humans, and there exists no safe dose of exposure. So any dose will increase the risk of developing cancers. So examples of class 1 carcinogens, apart from alcohol, include tobacco smoke, radioactive substances like polonium, asbestos,
things people are generally familiar with, and
arsenic, so highly toxic, certain pesticides, exposure to UV radiation, so sun exposure, exposure to X-rays, and so on, and so exposure to certain fumes from combustion engines and pollution caused by that. So those are class 1 examples of class 1 carcinogens proven to cause cancers in humans. Now, alcohol consumption is estimated to cause 750,000 of cancers a year, every year. And the most common alcohol-related cancers is breast cancer, colorectal cancer, the gullet cancer, so is cancer of the esophagus, liver cancers, and mouth and throat cancer. So essentially things that the alcohol touches in your body, and then the tissues that are more predisposed to the consequences of drinking than others. But these are not the only ones. These are just the 5 most common ones. You've mentioned that there's an increase, specifically well quantified, increased risk of drinking on breast cancer. This risk of developing of breast cancer in women who are not genetically predisposed to have it increases by approximately 7 to 10% with each 10 grams of alcohol consumed.
Yeah, wow.
That's a lot.
That is a lot.
So if you think about someone who drinks several units of alcohol every day, for each 10 grams of alcohol, of ethanol they consume, the risks goes up by up to 10%.
Right.
So we link this study as well in the show notes. But I think it's a good moment to pause and reflect of how quickly the risk ramps up as you increase the amount of alcohol that you drink.
Yeah.
What about the other organs or systems?
Well, I just wanted to mention that the first link for the increased risk of breast cancer due to alcohol consumption was first described in the late 90s. So we have a study we're going to link as part of the article we're looking at, but there's a study that even predates this, and some of these mechanisms are due to changes in hormone, right? That makes sense. Why the link between alcohol consumption and breast cancer? I think it's easy to logically think through, like you said, everything that the alcohol touches. But when we think of that and breast cancer, maybe that link isn't completely clear. So just to clarify where that comes from, and referencing this first study from 1999, alcohol can decrease testosterone and increase estrogen. And some of the changes that occur because of this are impacting muscle mass, your bone density, fertility, sexual functions. But this is also why this increase in breast cancer happens, is because of the relationship with hormones.
So not only makes it harder to build muscle mass, which we know is one of the strongest predictors of longevity, it also does it increases the level of estrogens, and not just estrogen, but also other hormones that are associated. And the association with the hormone receptor positive breast cancer is therefore clear. That's one of the primary mechanisms in which it happens. But you've already alluded to the second mechanism, which is the production of acetaldehyde as a consequence of metabolizing of ethanol, which is also a carcinogen on its own. So not drinking is bad, ethanol is a carcinogen on its own, then it's being processed in your body because your body needs to get rid of this, and in that process another carcinogenic substance is being produced. And on top of the genetic predispositions that we talked about, there may be others that make it more likely to suffer the consequences of acetaldehyde poisoning. and its impact on development of other cancers. So that's why this risk is so high, and that's why there will be some people in which that effect will be amplified. So there will be I think there are 9 gene variants responsible for this, and there in some individuals they're responsible for the dramatic increase in risk even at low amounts of alcohol consumed. So if you happen to be unlucky genetically in a way, small amounts of alcohol might have an impact on your risk of developing cancer, as it would be in people without those genetic predispositions who are heavy drinkers.
Right.
So without detailed testing, it's difficult to predict, but it still doesn't invalidate the fact that the more you drink, the higher the risk of developing diseases becomes.
So other systems that alcohol has been shown to negatively impact, we have, of course, straightforward alcohol and liver diseases.
Of course, because that's where it's metabolized.
Of course. Gastrointestinal diseases.
So let's talk about liver diseases maybe just a little bit more, because fatty liver disease is the one that we see most frequently, which comes with its own host of problems. It can lead to alcohol consumption can lead to the inflammation of the liver, which is relatively or could be relatively acute condition requiring immediate attention. It can also lead to liver cirrhosis, and the thing is that that's irreversible at that stage, right? So there's a liver can regenerate well, but only up to a certain point, and of course liver cancer, right, as a further consequence both of fatty liver disease and of liver cirrhosis. So yes, so multifaceted impact on one of your most important organs.
And similarly, inflammation and cancers of the stomach, esophagus, pancreas, all of the gastrointestinal diseases as well.
Yes.
We have impacts of alcohol on the immune system.
Correct.
More specifically, alcohol will increase your infection risk because it will weaken your immune system. Alcohol impacts fertility, pregnancy outcomes. We know we have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
That's on the impact on the baby if the mother drinks.
Right.
Yes.
So we know, and that's well documented as well, of course, alcohol and reproductive health. Alcohol and what other systems? Bone health?
Absolutely. Alcohol messes up the metabolism of the proper metabolism of calcium in the bones, calcium magnesium balance. It also makes it more difficult to absorb the calcium from the gut, from the intestines. So both of those mechanisms will lead to the having more brittle bones. Well, this destructive, let's say, function of a gut barrier, is far more reaching. We just talked about the impacts that it has on the immune system. Allows the bacteria that lives in the intestine to leak the toxins outside of the gut, for example, as well. It's one of the mechanisms of poisoning, and also one of the contributing factors to development of gastric system cancers. It also kills the microbes that tend to live in your guts, and we know that the importance of the microbiome on maintaining health and immunity, right? Independently from the T cell dysfunction, B cell suppression, right, in immune function and so on. So yes, so again, all of those things have more than just one impact, right? So reduced absorption of calcium, of course, yes, it's one of those consequences, independently of disrupting the bone remodeling process.
Right.
Yeah.
What about, since we're talking about bone remodeling and measuring bone densities, part of our evaluation of body composition, maybe we can also just mention alcohol and general body composition, because alcohol as part of the metabolism is stored as fat.
Yes.
And excess acetate that's produced during the metabolism of ethanol doesn't rely on insulin, so it's transported and oxidized rather quickly. And metabolism of ethanol is prioritized.
Yes.
Because not just because it doesn't require insulin as a transportation, but it also is a toxin and needs to be eliminated as fast
That
as
is correct.
possible.
Yes.
So because it is directly converted into fat, there's some obvious impacts to not just body composition, but then the ability for you to move. And if you have excess fat because you are consuming excess alcohol or alcohol in general, there's consequences of that physically.
Yes.
Now, what this means for things like muscle mass too, we mentioned that there's dose-dependent reduction in testosterone for both men and women.
Yes.
That leads to reducing lean muscle mass.
And making it harder to build if you're trying to maintain it.
To synthesize new protein, yes. So what does this mean for performance? So you're storing excess fat. You are at risk for decreased muscle mass.
And bone density.
So improvement of athletic performance. There is a myth, right, that alcohol improves athletic performance, but the data show that
Which
that's
we know it
just
doesn't, right?
not
Yes.
true.
Yes.
It's just not true.
We know it doesn't.
Just not true. And we're still not talking yet about the behaviors around alcohol before, during, and after alcohol consumption that can further compound these effects.
Yes. So no sane performance coach that
Right.
takes care of their athletes will ever recommend or allow them to drink alcohol. Like, we know of significantly detrimental impacts of alcohol on performance, but also, as you mentioned, on the risk of injuries, right? And I think that's from the point of view of longevity. We need to step outside of the world of sports here. If you want to live long, it's not enough to try to stay healthy. You also need to try to avoid things that are likely to either kill you prematurely or lead to a situation where you might be permanently disabled.
Right.
Now, alcohol is one of the most significant contributing factors to personal injuries, so like falls, which we know are dramatic in consequences, especially for elderly people. If you're over 70 and you fall and break a hip, there's a 50% chance that you will not survive a year from the time of the fall.
1 year.
Yes. So in people over a certain age, half of the people who break a hip bone will not survive the next 12 months.
Wow.
Because of the consequences of the fall.
Wow.
People tend to get into fights, right? Especially men, and so on. So the risk of personal injury increases. Alcohol is, again, one of the most significant contributing factors when it comes to road traffic accidents. Then can be either fatal or permanently debilitating to people as well. Workplace injuries, unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, and so on and so on. So these are the impacts of alcohol that are not directly linked to its short or long-term toxicity on your body, but have significant impact on your ability to live a long, healthy, and happy life.
That's right. And speaking of longevity, at the foundation of longevity, we talk about this all the time, is sleep. So maybe we can address now the myth that drinking alcohol can improve your sleep. That's not really true.
No.
And so let's talk about why ethanol. How does ethanol impact your REM and non-REM cycles?
Yes, so let's start with, where does the myth come from? Why do people think that this is the case? So when we look at sleep in general, there are multiple descriptors that define or describe the type and quality of sleep. So before we go into the sleep phases, which are necessary for restorative sleep, let's talk about something that is called the sleep latency. So sleep latency is the time between going to bed and falling asleep. And sleep latency is a parameter that people are often aware of. People will not be aware of how many phases of deep sleep they had, how many REM phases, whether they go into a REM phase and for how many times during the night, unless they use sleep trackers to monitor those specifically. So sleep latency you are aware of. because you know that you've been, let's say, laying in bed for an hour and couldn't fall asleep.
Yeah.
Now, alcohol reduces sleep latency because it's a sedative. It's a neurotoxin that is a central nervous system sedative, which helps you fall asleep, well, lose consciousness in a way faster.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but that does not mean that your sleep will be of better quality, of better duration, or be more restorative. None of those things are true.
Right.
So this creates the perception that it's easier to sleep, but you are not aware of the disruptions in your sleeping patterns that are happening later during the night. So the most significant is the one that you have mentioned. Alcohol interferes with the balance of progression from one sleep stage to another,
Mm-hmm.
which are essential for restoring the function of your brain when you're asleep. So the REM, which stands for Rapid Eye Movement Phase of Sleep, is the most important thing. This is where you consolidate your memories. This is where the learning gets embedded into the rest of the brain. That's what's responsible for short and long-term emotional regulation as well. That REM sleep is essential for normal functioning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, alcohol, again, it's a neurotoxin and it's a sedative. It's a depressant of the central nervous system. It will suppress the REM sleep in the first half and even longer of the night. It leads to a phenomenon called REM rebound later on, which will cause your sleep, you will see that it will be extremely fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you have the impression you went to sleep faster and you might sleep for longer, you're not getting any benefits from that sleep that are essential to the appropriate function of your brain.
And how many units of alcohol is required for that impairment to occur?
Any is enough, but not any amount. 1 unit of alcohol, let's say, is probably not enough to shorten the sleep latency.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for you to fall asleep faster or go into sleep faster, you will need to drink more.
Mm-hmm.
But even smaller amounts are enough to disturb early and late phases of your sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the fragmentation of deep sleep is another thing that is severely impacted by the alcohol. And this one, on the other hand, is a little bit more dose dependent, but the disruption persists even after the alcohol wears out or it's metabolized during the sleep. So we don't fully understand how that mechanism works, but we know that any amount you consume will have impact both of your REM and on deep phases of your sleep. So the stages that are most important for you or that you should care about when you go to sleep.
Yeah.
Now, I also use the term sleep fragmentation, which is how frequently do you wake up during the night. So alcohol, and again, almost in any amount, will cause more frequent waking up, typically during the second part of the night.
Mm-hmm.
That's directly related to ethanol, but also because alcohol is a diuretic, so it makes you pee, or wants to pee more often. You might, if you haven't drank too much, be lucky enough to wake up and have to go to the toilet in the earlier phases of the night as well.
Mm-hmm.
So your sleep throughout the night will be fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
It independently impacts the depth and the REM phases of your sleep when you consume alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Now we talked about the hormonal suppression that you get from alcohol. So melatonin is not properly produced when people are drinking. And because of the relaxation of muscles, if you have a condition like sleep apnea, for example, that is related to the, let's say, tight or how supportive are the muscle structures in your throat, alcohol will increase the risk of airway obstruction. In rare cases, it can be fatal, even in predisposed individuals. But because it prevents you from breathing appropriately, which leads to not enough supply of oxygen to your brain, which further damages the impact of alcohol on your brain. Now, this will all translate into what happens the next day, independently from hangover or from poisoning.
Right.
So poor quality of sleep will make you more fatigued. Poor restoration phase will make it more difficult to control your emotions. So a lot of people who chronically or regularly consume alcohol, they will be more irritable. They're much more prone to the symptoms of anxiety or depression. They will have significantly reduced, the things that we describe as hallmarks of cognitive performance. So your focus will be reduced, your reaction times will be slower, your decision making will suffer. So all those things, especially if they're continued, they will accumulate and make it progressively worse.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, it will lead to this disruption of circadian rhythm, as let's say how we describe the sleep-wake cycle.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't happen after a single episode of consumption of alcohol, but with repeated use, it would definitely have an impact.
Yeah.
So multifaceted, and we also know that sleep, for example, is essential for appetite control and regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another factor that can contribute to obesity. And we know that obesity is not necessarily a great thing for longevity either.
That's right.
So now you can start to see how the impact of alcohol on every organ system in your body starts to add up together to make you less healthy, less likely to live long.
And just continuously increase your risk for diseases that bring multifaceted impairment. In addition to sleep, what other effects does alcohol have on the brain and the central nervous system?
Well, I think we already talked quite a lot about this. It's a central nervous system toxin. It's a neurotoxin that will disrupt the function of your brain across the entire brain. So that would include the appropriate function, but also emotional regulation, and will lead to the damage of the nerve cells independently.
Yeah, so there's structural damage as well.
Yes.
Right.
So that's the problem, because while some of the effects or the negative effects can be restored when you stop consuming alcohol, the structural damage to the brain or to nerve cells is much more difficult to get rid of. So there are things, not every alcohol-related damage you can fully recover from.
Right.
That's why we recommend to minimize as much as possible exposure to alcohol if longevity is something you care about.
Right. And ethanol increases activity in the limbic region of the brain through dopamine and serotonin. So that reinforces your pleasure associated with it. We've all who've drunk experienced that, how does that relate to addiction then?
Well, addiction is a dopamine driven in the vast majority of cases. So that's one thing. But this disruption of hormonal balance in the brain leads to other consequences. So yes, so enjoyment and addiction is one side of that coin, but like depression, anxiety, or suicide risk are the other.
Right.
And when we talk about this, we're here just talking about the mood and emotional regulation as well, right? Which we've already touched upon. But there are others, right? There's the dependence is not just physical, but it's also psychological in people who regularly consume alcohol. And there's hardly any part of the brain that is spared from toxicity related to alcohol consumption.
Are there any supplements that are recommended to reverse are there any supplements that can be taken that can have some impacts or reverse some of the impacts of deterioration of the brain due to ethanol?
I'm not aware of any.
There is a study from 2013 that suggested maybe thiamine, but the study showed that thiamine supplementation correlated with recovery of some of the specific nerve damage that you mentioned, but only after complete abstinence from ethanol after a certain amount of time. I forget what the amount of time was, but there's other supplements or things people might take, milk thistle, things like that don't seem to have, at least in the context of ethanol-induced damage, cognitively, structurally, or functionally, really have any strong data associated with it.
Yeah, so for milk thistle, we know it doesn't work. Milk thistle is the city burn, right? I think the flower, which is a herbal supplement, and it's claimed to be anti-inflammatory or have some antioxidant properties, and it was sold or marketed as something that helps potentially with liver function. So it might increase what it does biologically increase the level of secretion of glutathione from the liver, but that doesn't really in any way help in any way with protecting your liver from alcohol-induced damage. Now, you've mentioned thiamine, which is the B1 vitamin. Yeah, vitamin B1.
Mm-hmm.
That is generally considered to be good for the nervous system, if that makes sense. And we think that's where the recommendations were appearing sometimes in the past, that if you are a chronic drinker with chronic abuse of alcohol, it might help because the alcohol virtually stops the absorptions of B vitamins, including B1, from the gut. So you will be deficient in vitamin B1 because you are unable to absorb it from food when you are drinking, or when you have been drinking alcohol. That's because of the damage of the alcohol to the lining of your gastrointestinal lining. And if it continues over time, it may permanently inhibit the ability to absorb thiamine from vitamin B1 from your gut. The other thing is it's typically, B1 is typically found in, well, let's say healthy foods like whole grains and legumes, those types of foods. And people who drink heavily are rarely conscious eaters either. So you have the lack of B1 in diet, damaged gastrointestinal lining, which makes the absorption difficult. So, and then you have, of course, the urinary excretion, because that's urinary excreted vitamin, and the alcohol will stop the conversion of vitamin B1 to, I forgot what the active form is. So because the vitamin B1 on its own is not what is needed by the body, it's its metabolite, which I forgot the name at the moment what it is. And that metabolite is essential for the appropriate function of the cells. But the challenges with this approach is that, one, supplementation will, well, as you said, first you need to completely stop drinking. That's one. The second thing is a sufficient amount of time needs to pass, and that's only if you are able to rebuild the gastrointestinal lining that will allow reabsorption. So people who drink, they might be B1 vitamin deficient and would probably need it in a different form than oral, because it's not going to be absorbed anyway.
Right.
But it doesn't reverse in any way the damage or impact of alcohol. It simply addresses the alcohol-induced B1 deficiency.
Right.
So I wouldn't call it protective for that reason in any way.
I think the metabolite is TPP.
Could be.
I think that's part of
I don't remember from the top of my head.
A Krebs cycle coenzyme, but doesn't. Yeah.
Yes, it's in the energy cycle.
Yes. So the reason I'm bringing the supplements up, not just because you are an expert in this, but when we think about recommendations for, especially around dietary recommendations, and coupling it with alcohol, based on what we've talked about so far, if we wanted to minimize the direct impacts of ethanol metabolism on protein synthesis and storing as fat, I think the best recommendation to make would be to delay alcohol consumption until foods containing carbohydrates and proteins were eaten. Right? This, at least you can ensure that you have the substrates that you need for resynthesizing glycogen, resynthesizing protein, and that you're not just replacing that energy from ethanol, rather than relying on supplements that don't really have strong data associated with them and are mechanistically much more complicated than just supplementing when you...
Yes, so this is a very interesting thing to look into. So alcohol consumptions together with food will... So first of all, I think we recommend not to drink at all in the first place. But if you already have to, it's best not to do this on empty stomach.
That's right.
The other reason is exactly what you have described, but also presence of food in the gastrointestinal tract slows down the absorption of alcohol into the blood, which may, if you consume alcohol in moderate or actually small amounts, may help with processing or metabolizing ethanol in the liver, because we know it's capped at approximately, let's say, 8 grams at a unit per hour.
Right.
So slowing down, let's say if you drink with your meal 1 unit of alcohol, 1 glass of wine throughout your dinner, you might avoid a lot of related toxicity.
Right.
Because you will, by the time it gets absorbed into the bloodstream and will be immediately processed by the liver, it will not accumulate excessively in the blood, leading to toxicity. So that helps, provided, especially if you drink very modestly, like small amounts of alcohol with meals. So that's one thing. The second reason is, as you outlined, it allows you to get absorb the other nutrients, right? We talked about vitamin B1, but we know that it's not like alcohol will deplete many other substances from the body, right? The definitely folates or vitamin B9. That's where you've mentioned this before. That's what causes the fetal disturbances if pregnant women drink, right? It just simply will not be there. But the same story for vitamin B6, for vitamin B12, vitamin B3, that they're all essential for appropriate regulation of neural function, of brain function. All of the antioxidants will be gone, like vitamin A deficiency, which is essential for seeing, but also an integral part of the immune system. It's necessary for being able for healthy skin, for fingernails. Alcohol will essentially deplete the liver storages of vitamin A rapidly. And it will also increase the excretion of retinol in urine. So like you're losing the stuff that you need to keep you healthy, and you're depleting the ones that you already have.
Not to mention just general loss of water.
Loss of water, so that it's a diuretic function, so it makes you dehydrated, right? You're going to lose vitamin D as well, and this is what further will contribute to the problems with bone health and bone density, right? You're going to lose another antioxidant, which is vitamin E, in a similar thing, but also will be prevented from being absorbed in your gut. It will be the same thing with vitamin K, which is essential for bone metabolism, right? Apart from blood clotting, and so on and so on and so on. So you're pretty much going to be deficient in everything if you are drinking, both through destruction of the reserves that you have, but also through the inability to absorb them.
Right.
So yes, one way to mitigate this is to do this with food, but I think that that only works when the consumption is very modest. You've also touched about the other problem with that type of approach. Alcohol will be used preferentially for energy. So everything that you will eat or drink together with alcohol will wait until you get rid of alcohol and you use alcohol metabolites for energy.
Right.
It means that even in isocaloric diet, so let's say you stay within your energy limits, when you add alcohol to it, it will not only create energy surplus, it will also make more likely to store everything that you've eaten as fats, because it will not be used to fuel your body. So you'll get less nutrients, and you will likely store most of the things you have eaten as fats, because the alcohol metabolites will be used for energy production first.
Right.
So yes, it might help with absorptions of nutrients, but it will definitely not help you keep healthy body weight when you do that.
Right. So bringing this back to the longevity perspective, we talked about sleep, impacts of alcohol on sleep. We've talked about extensively diet, body composition, ability to enjoy movement, not just because of the physical consequences that alcohol has, but also the mental consequences it has as well. Being able to function or perform at a level that you need to maintain an exercise routine. Yeah. We've talked about the cognitive aspects of this. And the last pillar of longevity maybe we can mention is just the impacts of alcohol on social connections, socialization, and relationships. I think we all can relate to this in some way. We talked about behaviors that can be described as social drinking, right? A lot of us will be around family during the holidays. Or friends during the holidays, and participating in social drinking. And so I think we just want to bring awareness to the obvious impacts that alcohol or overconsumption really can have on your social connections, and just being aware of the detriment. So thinking through whether the relationships that you keep that include alcohol as an aspect, how they pertain to longevity goals. Are they supportive? Are they not?
So that's a good question, because as you said, alcohol is let's say a social poison or a social drink that is frequently enjoyed with a group of people. So it might have a role in helping to build connections. And we know that maintaining of social connections
is essential.
Is important for longevity,
Yes.
for living a healthy and fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question here is, yes, it helps to build relationships, and relationships are important. The question is, are we building, or are you able to build the right type of relationships when the relationship evolves around alcohol?
Right.
Yes. Right. So are those, some people say that we are an average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. If our social life evolves around consumption of alcohol, I think it's necessary to reflect whether the benefits of the relationship or being socially connected with that particular group outweigh the risks of consuming alcohol in the first place. It doesn't seem to be the case. And there are other ways to build meaningful relationships than through consumption of alcohol.
Right.
Now, having said that, because I think it's important to notice, it's important to understand that we shouldn't be preventing ourselves from meeting with a group of people or sharing a glass of wine, during a dinner. It's just about being mindful of what the impact of our actions is. Because I think that what is important to understand for people who are listening to us is, like, what can I do practically so that I can get most benefits for my health?
Right.
And while, yes, ideally, you would not drink at all, but we talked about that the fact that the risk increases with every consumed unit of alcohol exponentially. But it also means that it exponentially reduces with every unit not drank.
Right.
Which means that if you choose to drink alcohol, a meaningful reduction of harm to your health does not necessarily have to mean that you immediately need to become an abstinent.
Right.
If you're a heavy drinker, every reduction will positively impact your health. So let's say you drink 3 glasses of wine a day. Now, if you cut 1 glass of wine, it will reduce the risk of coronary artery disease by 60%. Right? So that's, you're cutting your risk in half simply by drinking 2 glasses of wine instead of 3.
More than half, yeah.
That already has a dramatically significant positive effect on your health. It is also totally achievable.
Right.
But every little helps. Right? Every reduction helps.
And that kind of approach is true, and what we recommend for any changes to make for not just longevity, but any aspect of your physical, mental, or emotional health. The thing about alcohol is that it impacts all of those things directly and in many ways that are interrelated and a little bit complicated, but small changes, simply reducing by 1, regardless of where you start, is physically, emotionally, mentally, numerically significant.
It is, and it's also achievable.
And achievable.
It's much easier to make small adjustments in the right direction than to make big, dramatic, sudden changes to your life.
That's right. So our recommendation is simply try to reduce by 1 drink.
Well, our recommendation is don't start drinking if you're not drinking.
Right.
Because that's going to be bad.
Of course.
If you are already drinking, ideally, you should stop drinking at all. But that might be difficult or impossible to achieve. So just make the smallest step possible and cut 1 drink during your next meal, if that's sustainable. It's sometimes more difficult, especially if the amount of drinks that you consume is high, because alcohol consumption will impair your judgment or ability to resist temptations in general. Right? It will make you more likely to overeat, for example, as well. But as we talked, if you cut, if you drink 4 glasses of wine instead of 5, or 2 instead of 3, you are going to make a significant improvement to your health already.
Immediately.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, which we strongly recommend as a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else that we want to cover? I'm just wondering if I know there are some questions that people sometimes say that, what is better to drink? Are colorful things better to drink than spirits, and why? Because that's the question that I used to get in clinical practice.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, like if I'm drinking, is it better to drink clear alcohols like gin or vodka,
Okay.
or colored ones, right, like whiskeys or rums or red wine?
Okay.
And especially that shows up in the context of this red wine perceived to be healthy, even though we know it isn't. And there is some consensus around this, that clear alcohols, unit per unit, tend to be less harmful than colored ones, because the color typically comes from the process of manufacturing the drink. So it will contain tannins, it will contain a larger amount of methanol, which is a byproduct of producing the alcohol, and methanol is even more potent poison than ethanol. Some fossil oils and some other contaminants will be present in colored alcohols, which makes them theoretically even more toxic.
Right. Because just to clarify, alcoholic beverages or mixed drinks can still contain vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, antioxidants, polyphenols, flavonoids, but it will also contain other contaminants that may not be even really fully characterized in a mixed drink or a beer or a wine. We know that bottles of wine often contain labels around sulfates. That's one example of another contaminant that's a toxin as well.
Yeah, and gives you headaches.
And gives you headaches on its own. And that's just one example of something that we know is part of the production process.
Yes.
But there are many others.
They are.
So that's why, in terms of, is it better? You're probably less likely to ingest additional toxins when you stick to clear alcohols. Yes,
they also tend to have fewer calories because they have, let's say, less sugar content. So if weight is something you're struggling with,
right?
But then again, we're discussing here a situation which poison is less poisonous,
right?
Rather than, it's not that one is better than the other, right?
Exactly.
That's probably not the right way to think about this. Anything else?
This goes for not just alcohol, but when we think about alcohol and exercise, I'm working out now so that I can go out later. But we've discussed the prioritization of alcohol metabolism. So unlike calorie counting, and you mentioned this before, but unlike standard calorie counting where you are immediately replacing the energy out with food.
Yes.
Whether you have a mixed drink or, let's say, a colored alcohol, it is because of the way the body metabolizes ethanol. And in general, exercise and the calorie expenditure you spend exercising or moving it doesn't work exactly like banking system when it comes to replacing those calories expended with calories in. And it's even more not that when we think about how alcohol is metabolized.
Correct.
So in general, maintaining a regular schedule of movement and physical activity is beneficial for health, period. To think of it as a prerequisite to consuming alcohol, I think is dangerous, especially if that's the mindset going into, a night out. So I would just caution people to maybe think through that themselves and reframe it as keeping your mind and your body healthy. And it is absolutely fine to enjoy food and social time and keep your body moving in a healthy way in addition to that, not because of or in place of.
Absolutely. Again, moderation is key with everything. Anything else springs to mind? I know that there is one that I used to be asked. Another myth that I've been asked in clinical practice is whether especially during winter months, related to the fact that alcohol keeps you warm.
Oh, yes. Good.
which is, again, it's a myth caused by the discrepancy between what we feel and what actually is.
Oh, yes.
So you feel warm, you might feel warm after consumption of alcohol. And that's because the temporary perception of feeling warmer is because of dilation of the blood vessels that are close to the skin.
Right.
But that also means that much more heat escapes. This is why people who drink in winter, let's say homeless people, if they're drunk, they dramatically increase the risk of dying than someone who otherwise would be sober. So hypothermia is much more likely because it can rapidly lower your body temperature. So it's you're experiencing a significant loss of heat, but you have a perception of being warm. So that's one myth I have heard quite a few times or attended in working in hospitals or emergency services quite a few. The other one that I have dealt with is that, and that was especially people who are trying to explain their behavior after ending up in a car accident or harming themselves, their family, or others, is that they thought that if they drank and then they have a coffee, it will sober them up.
Oh, yes.
Which we know it has, like, one has nothing to do with the other.
No.
But because coffee is a minor stimulant,
Right.
it may create an impression of improvement, but it doesn't really do anything beneficial. There's nothing that you can do after you've consumed alcohol to make you more sober. The only thing is wait until the toxicity is gone. And because there's no substance that you can take that will make your liver metabolize alcohol any faster. It's just not going to happen. So coffee will not make you sober up. It will not make you react faster. Same thing with like showers. Some people say, oh, cold shower will help me sober up faster, or hot shower will help me sober up faster. It's just simply not true. I think the third one that I have heard in clinical practice is, especially when we discuss health impacts or certain prescription medicines to be or not to be taken with drinks, there is a belief that some alcohols are, like beer is fine because it contains only 5%, and like gin has 40%, so gin is worse. But the truth, it isn't. It just depends on the volume consumed, right? Like we talked about this, that a small shot of gin, 25 grams of gin, is 1 unit of alcohol, but a pint of an average beer is 2.
Right.
Or a 5% beer that's a pint would be almost 3 units.
Right.
So in terms of the damage to your health, a can of beer is worse than a shot of gin.
Right.
And because it simply contains more units of ethanol, right? So there is no that one alcohol is better than the other. You need to learn how to calculate the amount of units and what you're consuming in order to gauge the impact, the harmful impact it will have on your health.
Right.
Common one when I was at the university was that if you mix different types of alcohol, it will make you drunk faster. That was the one. Now, but the thing is, it doesn't. Right? It's the same principle that the only thing that matters is the total amount of alcohol, of the poison that you consume. Now, it's much like if you mix multiple things, they might be more palatable and you consume more. Or if you, let's say, normally you would have 2 units of alcohol in a cocktail or a drink, but you mix 3 different ones. Well, now you consume 6. So it's simply the increase in the total amount of alcohol consumed that makes you more drunk, not the fact that you're mixing.
What about the phrase, beer before liquor makes you sicker? Liquor before beer, you're in the clear.
Yes, again, it has absolutely no reason. Now, there might be some principles in this. For example, if you're already dehydrated and you consume a beer, which has a smaller, so there's more water in beer than there is in harder liquors. So you simply might be allowing yourself to be hydrated a little bit more before a large volume of ethanol hits your liver, hits your body. And it might create a certain perception, but broadly speaking, again, it's the total amount of alcohol, of units of alcohol consumed that matters, not the order in which you drink them. Yeah. Anything else? There is one. So we know it's biological one, and especially now, we hear it now that, women can drink as much as men. Which again is not true. Not true because there are certain biological... So women are typically have more fat tissue and less lean body mass than men. They're typically smaller, so they have smaller volume and weight. And all these factors, like this smaller volume of distribution, will have an impact on toxicity. But apart from that, even if a man and a woman are of comparable size, the enzymatic activity of the enzyme that you've mentioned before is different in men and women, which makes women more susceptible to effects of alcohol than men. And on average, this is estimated to be approximately 30%. So let's say if a safe dose for a daily for a woman would be 2 doses, for a male it might be up to 3. It's simply due to the different enzymatic activity of the enzymes responsible for metabolizing of alcohol. So the impact of alcohol on women is approximately 30% higher than for similarly sized men.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have one. Coming back to college, I remember someone said that they could only do their assignments for their creative writing classes if they had a buzz, that they were more creative.
Interesting.
With alcohol, but I think that was more, alcohol just lowers your inhibitions and makes you feel more creative, but there's no actual benefit on cognitive function. It decreases.
No, it's actually the opposite.
Function,
yeah, it actually makes it worse. Yes. Yeah. So college was, now going back, that was actually many myths I've heard. One was that the more we drink, or the more you drink, the more you can train your liver to be better at processing alcohol. So that you drink more, that you'll become better at drinking.
Wow.
Again, that's a myth, because it's actually exactly the opposite. Heavy drinking increases the damage to the liver, therefore reducing your ability to process ethanol. That's it.
Yeah.
You cannot train your liver to be any better. You can only damage it from drinking.
So we started this episode by talking about how to drink for your health, or how there really is no such thing as drinking for health, but only minimizing the negative impacts. So we've talked about the science behind it. We've talked about all of the different impacts that alcohol has on multiple systems of the body, including social systems, and hopefully have debunked a couple of common myths around alcohol consumption and tolerance, sex differences, genetics, and behavior. We're going to link our articles to this. We have a part of our solutions manual on alcohol.
Yes.
And we'd welcome any comments and questions.
Success stories as well, especially during the holiday season.
Yeah.
Yeah. See if you can reduce the amount of alcohol you normally consume, even slightly, and see how that makes you feel the next day or during the day when you are choosing to drink.
Yeah.
Any reduction will have a meaningful and positive impact on your health.
Yeah. Leave the last sip, observe, tell us about it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.